Welcome to another interview with El Vocero Hispano. Today I have Jeff Smith with me. He is a very involved person with the community, and he also volunteers his time with Movimiento Cosecha Grand Rapids, which is a activist group that focuses on the immigrant rights. We have seen them involved in many things, so we have Jeff Smith here. He is going to focus on his new book that he recently wrote, and I am very excited to learn more about what it's about and what basically inspired you. So thank you so much for your time and being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So like I mentioned, your new book, it's called A People's History of Grand Rapids.
Yes.
It's a really interesting title. I think it's something that maybe all of us should probably pick up and read. But can you tell me a little bit more about what the background is of it? What can we find in it?
Sure. It's called that because it's modeled after Howard Zinn's book called A People's History of the United States, which basically is doing history from below, right? So, you know, most history books focus on people in power or famous people, kind of history from above, right? Where this is, history from the perspective of immigrants, of workers, of racial minorities, of, people who usually don't get included or get just a footnote in history. But this is sort of elevating voices of folks who've been mostly marginalized in a lot of our history textbooks. So it's the same thing here. Grand Rapids, was founded in 1850, but the book starts with the early 1820s when Euro-American settlers came to the area and essentially displaced the indigenous population, took their land, and sort of colonized the area. So I think it's always important just to sort of recognize and remember that Grand Rapids is sort of founded on displaced indigenous land, basically, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of the book deals with the history of sort of different social movements or marginalized communities, whether it's the African American, the Black freedom struggle, or workers' movements, or women's rights, or environmental issues, or immigrant justice, anti-war movements, all those kinds of things. And it brings, the book really goes all the way up until about 2021, having to do with the sort of Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing movement to Cosecha and so forth. Those movements that continue to fight for justice and change today. So
I think that's all super interesting because we live here in the city, but we don't. I doubt, or I don't really know, but I assume that many people don't really know the history of it. And honestly, like what we're living right now, it is part of history too in next few years. So it's super cool that you're including that in your book, especially the perspective of communities that form part of it. So.
Yeah, and I try to, again with the people's history. So it's really, I did a lot of research on archival materials, so we get to hear directly from people who were involved in various struggles, as well as doing interviews with people who are currently involved in movements, so that we're hearing their voices.
Yeah.
And then besides that, then it's sort of juxtaposed with, the kinds of systems of power and oppression that they're fighting against, right? And that's sort of the ongoing pushback that takes place, right? Because, fighting for change is never easy. It's systems of power don't just want to give up or do whatever the public movements are demanding easily. So, so it provides that sort of context as well, so people realize like what it is that people are fighting for and who's opposed to it and the pushback they get and those kinds of things, which I think is always really interesting for people to recognize that dynamic. And so again, there are historically people and groups and entities that have pushed back, and then I sort of name the same forces for today that are also kind of like saying, no, we don't want this to happen, et cetera. So it's in many ways it's sort of a counter narrative to sort of what a lot of people know about Grand Rapids. We know the names of famous wealthy people whose names are on buildings, but we don't know what they really, where their wealth comes from and how it was built and what their what they've been resisting for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Kinds of things. So that's why I think it's important that people, at least, you know, we can agree to disagree on one's interpretation of history, but I think it's important for people to recognize that there is another narrative that's not usually what people are familiar with.
Yeah, and they usually tell us to kind of decide or be firm in the decision or an opinion of ourselves. We just have to look at all the perspectives. So
Right.
I think that's interesting that you're including it in this book.
Yeah.
What would you say inspired you to write this specific book?
Well, two things. One, I taught Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States for years, you know, which is essentially a history of U.S. social movements. I use it as a class, and he died in 2010, and somebody suggested, a friend of mine suggested that you should do a history of People's History of Grand Rapids, which made a whole lot of sense to me. So I've been working on it essentially for the last 10 plus years. But the other main thing is that I also have been myself since the early 80s. I've been involved in various social movements in Grand Rapids, the Central American Solidarity Movement, anti-war movements, environmental justice movements, immigrant justice movements, and so forth. And so I always sort of have felt that the perspective of people involved in movements hasn't been adequately reflected in, you know, the dominant media or in the historical narratives about what's been happening. So, so I've also had kind of a firsthand, you know, a frontline world view of these movements since the early '80s, and so a lot of people that I, you know, interviewed, or a lot of archival material, you know, I've been involved in some of that stuff directly myself. So I felt it was important to provide that kind of narrative, to particularly to elevate voices that have been historically marginalized.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that just hearing you and just seeing the summary of your book, I really like that it includes different communities and, you know, the minority communities. So like you mentioned, the voices that don't get heard. So
Right.
I think that's that's good.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where can people find your book? Where would it be available?
So I had it published through Chapbook Press, which is part of Schuler Books.
Okay.
So they can purchase it at Schuler Books. They can also get it at Books and Mortar, which is in the southeast part of Grand Rapids on Cherry Street near Diamond, both of which are independently owned bookstores.
Okay.
They can also get it directly from me because I've been selling them. I also have it, besides being in hard paperback copies, I also have PDF versions if people want digital versions as an option. And then I've just been trying to do as much speaking and reading and book signing as I can since it came out, only just at the end of March. So it's only been a few months that it's been out, but it's already done really well. I think we've sold over 300 copies. And,
Okay, that's good.
So.
Yeah. Are you having any events where people can probably meet you in person or get signing or purchase it?
The African American Museum and Archives, which is run by artist George Baird, it's in downtown Grand Rapids on Monroe Center.
Okay.
They're doing a thing on July 7th, which is a Friday, I believe, from 6 to 8. So I'm going to read a little bit, talk a little bit, and then have a conversation with people, and then people, if they want to purchase the book, they can get it. If they want me to sign it, I'm happy to do that. That kind of thing, for sure. And I'm trying to set up some other ones in some of the more outlying communities in Lowell and Rockford and Ada, at some of the, again, smaller independent bookstores who have definitely expressed an interest in carrying it. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Just one next question before we end the interview is, why do you believe people should read your book or purchase it?
Well, I think, again, as I've said, because it elevates voices that have not been heard very much, that it provides a counter narrative to what we've officially been told about Grand Rapids, and I also think that it can be a source of inspiration for people that because I'm a firm believer that social movements are what fundamentally change things in the country's history. So, and I particularly wrote it for younger folks
Okay.
who maybe are just, new to movement work and haven't, sometimes it's easy to feel isolated and marginalized, but I think if people realize that they're part of a long legacy of people who've been struggling for change, and they're not, just starting, they haven't started something new, they're sort of standing on the shoulders of people who've been at this for more than 2 centuries in this community.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for letting us know the insights. I have the book right here if you guys are interested. Could you kindly tell me how many chapters there are, how many pages?
There's 10 chapters, and including the endnotes, I think there's about 222
Okay.
pages.
Yeah.
Completely,
I don't want to open it and be like.
So 10
Yeah.
chapters, an introduction, and an epilogue. And there's also, interestingly enough, there are a lot of prints. For each chapter, there's at least one print that students from Grand Valley made
Okay.
because a professor would have me come to their class to do People's History talks, and that the students would then make prints based upon some aspect of
Okay.
social movements in Grand Rapids history. So it was really nice that they let me include their prints in the book, because it adds, I think, a nice visual reflection of the struggle that people have been involved in.
Okay, that's super interesting. I'm definitely interested. I will be reading this.
Great.
So, like I mentioned, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for giving us this different perspective.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes. For more information about this book, it's called A People's History of Grand Rapids. It is written by Jeff Smith, who we have here on set. We can put the link on our description once this video is out for you guys to purchase if you are interested. It is definitely interesting, a different perspective of our city that we currently live in, which is Grand Rapids. For more interviews in English and Spanish, you can visit El Vocero Hispano TV on YouTube. You can visit our website, elvocerous.com. Like I mentioned, our interviews are available on our social media platforms. So if you're interested, please take a look at that.